Hello! In this video, we're going to start our discussion on swordsmen in your writing. So the first thing to think about is, why do you want to write a swordsman specifically? So obviously that could be just based on the style of story that you're trying to do. It could be historical fiction, during a time period that they actually used swords. It could be a fantasy novel. It could be contemporary, but that would have to be a very, very specific thing that would make it make sense. So first of all, just understand why do this thing, right? So obviously, like, one honest answer is swords are cool. As you can probably tell, I like swords. I like using swords. I think they're fun. They're actually an interesting way to also think about other aspects of the world. So obviously the stuff that I'm going to mention in this video and in future videos are going to be mostly from, again, my own personal experience as a swordsman. Also, I'm going to take some literary ideas from a few other places. But let's just get started with why write swordsman, right? I guess what I'll do first is just tell you why I like swordsmanship and stuff like that in general. So you might be able to kind of pick some ideas here and there to kind of like boost ideas for your own characters and stuff like that. For me, swordsmanship is kind of part of like a trifecta, right? So on the one hand, it's obviously a physical thing, right? So you learn how to do this thing, you enjoy the rush of the actual fight, and all that fun stuff. There's another, a little bit more philosophical aspect, or even like spiritual aspect, if you want to think of it that way. They're like, okay, I'm trying to like better myself by training in martial arts. I am learning how to have self-control and all that fun stuff. And the third one, and this is kind of what makes me probably really weird, I like to be able to apply almost like academic or like the core philosophical or like the physical aspects of swordsmanship to other aspects of my life, and as well as just the world. Now I'm going to start with that one because that sounded the weirdest, but let's do a little bit of that. So I'm weird. We're going to start with that. I'm weird, but I like to think about the way the sword moves in the sense of how it interacts with your body. Now again, from that perspective, I mean like kinesiologically. There we go. So like how using a sword can be actually just really easy depending on how you integrate with your body. Depending on the sword style that you're using. So for example, Gumdo is very, very, very good in terms of the way you move. It is how you kind of naturally do it, just with some some tweaking here and there. So for example, the equal and opposite motions in your body. So this is the physical aspect I was talking about, like the physics of the way you move. The equal and opposite in your body, right? So when you do a center cut, you feel like your core kind of push up. You feel a little bit of your hips sink back a little bit. So the hips sink back as your sword comes forward, as you prepare, right? So as you prepare up here, you feel again like the muscle stretching and stuff like that. You feel the equal and opposites going on, and when you release, you exhale, there's that synchrony, and you're able to, again, equal and opposite in the other direction as you cut. So for me, swordsmanship is physics. Swordsmanship is biology. Swordsmanship is geometry, which I know everyone hates, but it's geometry without the proofs, because no one likes proofs. No one. Not even mathematicians. We don't like it. Stop doing it. But no, we shouldn't stop doing it. Anyway, it's all of these different aspects all in one idea, right? So for me, swordsmanship is the culmination, or like a way, or even like a gateway to understanding all these other things from a very physical perspective. And if you do that, you're going to notice that the way you understand your own swordsmanship is going to influence the way you think about your spirituality, or the more mental aspects of it, as well as, again, the physical rush and like the enjoyment of it. So for example, the way you understand that equal and opposite, right? So the way you know how your body moves such that it doesn't damage itself, but it's able to throw a couple pound heavy weapon through the air into an opponent's So a metaphorical opponent's cranium is going to influence the way you move throughout the world. Now, obviously, you're not going to throw a heavy weapon into someone's face because A, illegal, B, morally probably wrong unless it's self-defense, and C, just don't do it, right? It's not very kind unless if it's consensual, which is sparring. But in general, understanding that is going to help you understand your own body, right? So for example, when I move through the world, I'm very conscious about my muscle activation, right? So for example, the physical aspect of doing swordsmanship makes me prioritize my lower core, my glutes, a little bit more on the thighs, as well as the lower back. So those are all the major aspects I like to focus on when I'm doing swordsmanship. I am now aware of that as I move out through the world. So for example, when I walk, I try to think more about the glute activation, right? Feel like how the lower back meets the glute as you kind of just walk throughout the world. You notice that your back is a little more straight. You're able to perceive more because you're no longer just doing this kind of thing. You're perceiving more. The way you learn how to breathe in your swordsmanship is going to affect how you breathe in your everyday, motion, right? In general, so this is not going to be attack. I guess this would be technically attacking a certain type of person, but for example, some people who tend to train in martial arts tend not to be mouth breathers, and by that I mean they kind of move throughout the world, kind of like, right? They tend to be a little bit more conscious. They know how to manipulate the air intake and all that fun stuff. They know how to perceive the world a little bit more, and all that fun stuff. So the physical aspect of it. So again, I love. So for example, combining I'm doing these three things. So if you see my hands do that thing, that's what I'm doing. So the geometry that I'm kind of working with my own body, how that affects my sparring, right? Because what is sparring but geometry, right? I want to be in your range. I want you to be in my range so I can cut you, but I don't want your sword near me, right? So that's a bunch of different geometry, different footwork, and understanding how to manipulate and move around your opponent, which is physics, which is geometry, which is biology, right? Because you're aiming for specific portions of the body and knowing what that will do, right? So if I cut you here, I know you're going to have a hard time, lifting this hand. You might still be able to thrust if you really use your shoulder or your deep shoulder. But by understanding the physical, the academic portions of that swordsmanship, you're going to be able to understand different portions of, again, everyday movement. So that is one aspect of swordsmanship that I think most people just absolutely just don't think about because I'm weird. As you probably don't know, my background is actually in engineering as well as philosophy, as you can probably tell from that. So I like to apply these different aspects to my swordsmanship. You can also go even super nerdy and think about types of friction, right? So you have kinetic and you have static friction. It's like the way we're both holding a stance is going to be static friction, but then when you're sliding, you're kind of understanding how friction interacts with how you're pivoting and stuff like that. That's really nerdy, really boring, but if you're interested in that kind of thing, look into it, right? So you might have a character who enjoys applying the physical world aspects, so friction coefficients and angular velocity, right? That's what swords are, angular velocity, and oh no, I forgot the word. No, being able to impart your momentum, that was the word I was looking for, and all that fun stuff. And it doesn't need to necessarily be a swordsman. So I'm going to try to use swordsmanship as a guide towards all this kind of stuff because, again, swordsmanship is one of my biggest things, right? Right? So you can also have a character who understands the world through these more academic perspectives. Now, that person doesn't need to be, a big old nerd like I am. They can just be a normal person being it's kind of weird, as I'm moving, as I'm, walking down the hallway, these physical attributes are happening, or oh, I am now aware that because there's water on the floor, eventually this room is going to turn into 100% humidity, so long as there's water on the floor. Which is also just kind of like a weird thing for someone to think about, but it's a true thing, right? So it's just one of those things that if you kind of know that people do make these connections, and it's not just in novels where you are trying to, you know, make weird characters, it happens. Another aspect, I'm going straight this way, another aspect that people think about when they do martial arts, and I guess sword, maybe sword specifically, but martial arts in general, is the more spiritual aspect. So this could mean, again, being aware, right? So working on your awareness of, you know, the situation around you, being aware of your breathing, being aware of the way you move, and also just maybe some calm, right? A lot of people do go into martial arts seeking a little more control over their own lives, right? Because, again, we live in a world where there's so many external factors that affect how you live. That's nice to have something that you can be like, all right, I can't affect, you know, my wages. I can't affect, you know, how a pandemic is like striking a nation. But I can understand, you know, how my body works. I can understand how to calm my mind. So this is also a very major aspect for a lot of people when they go into martial arts, is learning that mentality, right? So martial arts is also a mentality depending on, well, depending on, you learn different mentalities according to different martial arts, according to different time periods, and also depending on your own instructor. So for example, I myself don't do meditation. I should do meditation. I know I should. I have access to doing meditation, but it's not something that I prioritized in the past. I mean, again, I know I should, so don't at me. But there are going to be clearly people who do. So for example, my current instructor is, right? So he is very into the stretching and the breathing and the self betterment of martial arts. And that is a very big aspect of swordsman as well. So just keep that in mind, but there are going to be other aspects of that philosophical or the mental aspect that I do myself. So again, I'm just kind of prattling on just so you have ideas that you can kind of like, oh, like this character is really very conscious about the way the body moves, but he's completely oblivious to what, you know, this person thinks of him. Right? But so, for example, another thing that I like to think about, like, so a transition from that swordsmanship into, again, my mental life, is the ability to, I don't call it ability, just general perception, right? So whenever I'm looking at things, I'm also very aware of what's in my periphery, just because that is something that swordsmen need to be aware of. And now that I just said that, I'm now hyper aware of what's going on over here. So that's very distracting. So if you see me just kind of like look around a little bit more, that's what just happened. But now you're aware of it, right? So martial arts is also just about awareness. Awareness of your own thoughts, awareness of your body, awareness of other people, other people's distances, which is a little bit more of a physical thing. And it's also something that's kind of interesting to think about from a psychological perspective. I forget the actual term, but there's allegedly a distance at which someone is uncomfortable if you're too close. And you might think of it as like personal space and stuff like that. And every person's going to be different according to different people. So martial arts in general, especially if they do a lot more of the sparring, are very aware of distances. So for example, like if I am holding conversations with my students, and I notice that I'm a certain distance, and they kind of like do a little bit of a waver, right? Or they're trying to stay still, and they kind of like do a little bit of a rock. I know I'm too close, right? Because like I'm now in their safety zone, so they are trying to maintain control, but they're kind of like, all right, like you're my instructor, I need to pay attention to you. So it's a really good way for you to also think about, again, distance and how distance interacts with the way people behave. So obviously, that's going to change according to different people, right? So if you and I were best buds and we're like sitting right next to each other, it's fine. It's like it's whatever, right? Or if you're like my most hated enemy, which I don't think I have. I have to think about that, but I don't think I have a hated enemy. Or someone I just like clearly just don't know, or someone I really just don't trust. that distance is going to be a little bit more in my sparring distance, right? But here's also another interesting thing. For certain types of people, a certain distance is optimal. So again, if you're a fighter, it might be just outside your ability to kick or cut or something like that. So if there's someone that I really don't trust, I would rather have him or her in this particular place where I know if I need to, I could close the distance and be like, disable, right? Or to thwart. I would rather have that person here as opposed to like up against a wall or like hiding in the corner or something, because I'll be more aware of someone in my fighting distance. So that's just another aspect that you can think about for your own characters is distances. And in a similar vein to that is, what is the floor? That sounded really weird, but like, alright, so like, are we on, a very smooth floor where I can slide, right? Can I go all suriashi on you and kind of like slide towards you? Or are we outside in the grass where I don't really want to tear things up, so I'm going to do a lot more linear stepping? Are we, in rocky terrain where I probably want to do rolling steps? So martial artists, especially if they train not just in one place, are very aware of the floor. Now this is also, so just because I just listened to something on Writing Excuses, which is a podcast that Brandon Sanderson and co. do, this is also true for people with some physical disabilities. So they also want to be generally aware of the floor. So for example, again, this is the example that was given in that podcast, so I highly recommend looking up Writing Excuses. I think this was season 14 with physical disabilities. For example, someone who has epilepsy wants to know like what's around them, right? So if they look at the floor, they want to know that they're not going to like, if they do hit their head, it's not going to be like instant crush, right? So just like people with physical disabilities, people who do a lot of martial arts are usually more aware of, again, the floor. They're also more aware of things that might get in the way in terms of like if I need to move a certain way. That's also going to be different between a swordsman and an open hand fighter or a grappler. I imagine, because I'm not a grappler, but I imagine grapplers are going to be even more focused on the floor because they're going to be spending allegedly more time on it. Or if they want to throw someone, if they want to hurt the person, they're more aware of like the harder portions of the floor. If they want to roll to get away, they're going to be more aware of like the softer or like the more curved portions of the floor, different portions of the floor. So that's just another thing to, again, rack into your brain, just for raw data for you to add into some characters. And one more aspect is just going to be the thrill, right? So obviously, I like swordsmanship because obviously I get to apply my academic stuff to it. I get to apply my philosophical and my spiritual, if you want to call it that, or my mental aspect to it. But if I'm also honest, I just like fighting. Right? I like being able to have that physical interaction and be able to like hit someone with a nice well-timed Mizani strike or a nice thrust or a nice deflect cut, all sorts of fun with that. Now that could also be a very major aspect of your swordsman character as well, because there is a rush to fighting. There is one, right? So there's like, it gets your blood pumping, there's the adrenaline, there's the payoff, right? Which is something that a lot of people don't necessarily think about is there's the payoff of actually doing something, right? So like, if we're just sparring at this distance and we never really close that gap, meh, right? It's kind of like meh. Versus if I get that satisfaction of a few good times, pa-pun! That feels really good. There's dopamine flowing in my brain and all fun stuff. So the thrill of a fight is obviously going to be a major aspect, but it's not the biggest aspect, at least for a lot of people. I think this is something that a lot of writers and people who don't necessarily do a lot of martial arts themselves kind of, I won't say get wrong, but it's something that they misunderstand quite a lot. Especially in a lot of media, like the thrill of the fight is like the major drive for a lot of fighters. Which just isn't as true, like especially in more modern times, where martial arts is used also as different ways of becoming aware and all that fun stuff. The sheer thrill of a fight isn't that big as a lot of people think. Especially if you are doing it in historical perspective or in a battlefield perspective, you're doing it to survive. You're probably not getting like an adrenaline high off of it. You're trying to like not die, which is also going to impact how you fight. So just keep that in mind, right? So again, people do generally get some sort of rush from sparring, but it's usually not enough to be like the main driving force for your character. Now that said, you can absolutely have a character that does that. So for example, I'm writing a character who does have that. That's more from an addiction perspective as opposed to a typical fighter perspective. I know this video was a little bit more on the long-winded perspective. It was a lot more about me just kind of talking about my ideas about swordsmanship and how it interacts with my everyday life and all that fun stuff. So this was mostly to be a raw data dump for writers who just like, I'm tired of writing, you know, like the assassin who's just like, oh, I'm gonna kill people because they're bad. That's it, right? So especially if you're writing from first-person perspective, which is what I usually do, having these details will be more on the fun side, right? So like the more truly specific details that you have, the more real something's going to be. That's what we call grounding, right? So grounding something in concrete language as opposed to something like, I fight because it's fun. Right? That's not really compelling, right? Like, oh, I like to fight because there's that, like, that I love, like, the sound of, like, a thwap of, like, again, for kendo, I love the sound of that shinai hitting a kote. Like, I just love that sound. Or, I really love the way, like, this is gonna sound really weird, so not out of context, I really love the way when I stab someone with a flexing sword from Hema, I love the way it kind of like bends and it snaps back out when I'm releasing it. Like, I love that tension that you can feel. If you have these really specific details, right, so even if it is about a thrill, specific things to ground it, right? So for example, I'm not going to enjoy every single aspect of a fight. I don't enjoy the, you know, like, alright, let's reset so make sure we're not going to hit the wall or something. I don't enjoy the, like, okay, I got that cut, but that was because you're stupid, right? I love, like, the actual thing, like, alright, I'm going to try to do this thing, or I see something, I'm going to try to react this way, and when it happens, it's like, yes, it's so good. So keep that in mind, right? So most characters or most fighters don't just get off on fighting in itself. It's usually the very specific things, right? So if you do write that kind of character. But, again, there are tons and tons and tons of different aspects of being a swordsman that you can hone in on. Again, they could be a little more in the spiritual aspect. They could be a scholar trying to apply physics, right? So like maybe if you want to take like a more contemporary fiction perspective, like, oh, I'm going to put, you know, not gyroscope, what is that called? No. Oh no. Is it a gyroscope? I don't think it's a gyroscope. The thing that measures change in momentum. Whatever. I put that thing on a sword. I want to like measure how quickly it changes. I want to measure, you know, the velocity, the acceleration, the jerk, and whatever is the next derivation of jerk. I want to do all these mathematical things and see like how to like mathematically optimize my sword fighting. Obviously, that's going to have limitations, but keep that in mind, right? So a swordsman is not just someone who's like, I have a sword, I am going to kill you with this sword, right? Like, oh, I'm going to kill you with this sword geometrically, or I'm going to do it with a very clear mind because like I'm working on my you know, mentality aspect. So there's always going to be all these different aspects of potential aspects of your swordsman. So just keep those guys in mind. So a writing drill, right? So just things to have some fun. Try writing someone who, so first of all, if you're used to writing the, you know, I am an assassin, I stab people for fun. First of all, try someone who just doesn't like stabbing, but they like having knives for different reasons, right? So maybe they find it really calming just the way you can spin a knife in your hand. I've never tried it. Don't try it without any training. Don't try it don't try this at home. Maybe he or she just enjoys just the feel of having knives, like throwing knives against a wall or something like that. Also try writing, or at least, let's just say, try writing a paragraph in first person, getting used to a character's voice of someone who is very academic about the way they fight. Try writing someone who is just like only about the thrills, but very specific thrills, right? So not just, I love, bathing in the blood of my enemies. Like, no, I like to, again, hit a certain way. I like the way that, like when you get a good hit and the other person is just like, which is also really fun. So again, be very, very specific, and also try have someone who is, again, in the spiritual portion of that swordsmanship, right? So almost like, maybe for fun, think about having a swordsman who almost thinks of the way they use their sword as almost like religiously, right? So like maybe it's an instantiation of their faith or of their spiritual beliefs and all that fun stuff. But with that, so again, I know this is an info dump, which is always the beginning of not always the best stories, but it's an info dump. So have some fun with those drills, and as always, so stay humble and keep writing. Have a good one.